Hello guys, and here I am with Paul Bristow from the Croix de Guerre Living History Society. And Paul, you've brought some fascinating things with you today. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do in your...
Yes, the Croix de Guerre is a living history society. We represent the French army from the period of 1913 through to 1940. When it comes to aspects of the First World War, we very much like to bring as many artefacts as we can, original where possible, to illustrate the points that we're trying to make to educate the public about the conflict. A lot of people are very au fait with the concept of the trenches, the fighting, various individual battles, but there is actually a deeper and more sinister legacy left over from the First World War, which is the legacy of the unexploded munitions left over from the fighting.
Can you tell us about what is happening in the ground at the moment?
Yes, at the end of the First World War, obviously the guns fall silent, as everybody knows, at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November 1918, and at that stage you've had 4 years of almost continuous fighting. The First World War, to start with, was a fairly mobile war and eventually settles down into the trenches, and ironically actually at the end of the war it started to get a little bit more mobile again, and the trenches featured slightly less in certain sectors of the line. The front line itself was actually 540 miles long and runs from the Belgian coast up near Newport, down through Ypres, onto northern France, crosses northern France, before going over the top of a small mountain range known as the Vosges, and then stopping at the Swiss border. It was anywhere between a mile to 40 miles deep in places, and such was the intensity of the constant bombardment fighting over exactly the same piece of ground that it averages out an equivalent of 1,000 shells for every square metre of that front line falls during the course of the First World War. 15% of those are chemical weapons, and the rest are high explosive. But due to two factors mainly, there was a high problem with shells being fired and failing to explode when they actually reach their target. The main one was that because of the nature of wartime production, obviously it's what would otherwise be a skill job for an actual arsenal to produce shells and shell fuses. A lot of the fuse work was subcontracted out, and these things are being produced under pressure, with a need to produce in quantity rather than quality necessarily. And as a result, you've got around about a 15% failure rate in every single fuse, with every single of the bulk of the fuses produced. When you get to places like Ypres, you've got a much more raised water table than you would otherwise encounter anywhere else along the length of the line, and that means that you get a huge amount of mud. Now, if you're firing an artillery shell and you're relying on the impact of the shell on the ground to detonate it, that then, if you're going into soft mud, basically the shell will land without the action of the fuse taking place, and you can then have a build-up of these within the ground. Subsequently, what that actually equates to is that if you go to visit the battlefields today and you go to any of the major memorial sites, you are looking at every metre that you cross on foot. Potentially beneath your feet there is anywhere from 150 to 250 unexploded bombs for every single metre.
And you're saying that these are affecting actually the lives of people that are living in those areas right now?
Yes, very much indeed. We take Ypres as an example. It's one town on the length of the line, the Battle of Passchendaele, which was the third Battle of Ypres. And just in that area alone, the advantage of obviously time and hindsight is that we actually do know how many shells were fired as a total over the course of the entire fighting around Ypres. If you only applied a 15% failure rate to this, that equates to 300 million tonnes of unexploded ordnance just around one town on that line. Between Belgium and France, you're looking at an extraction rate by the bomb disposal teams of about 900 tonnes a year. But as you can say, just if you take Ypres as that one example, that is merely scratching the surface. It's nowhere going anywhere near where you need to be. Anybody who has a job that involves digging down into the grounds will come into contact with this stuff. Basically, you've only got to go a metre or so down within certain areas, and items will come out. Some of them can be relatively benign. It can be buckles, it can be remains of rifles, helmets, etc. But obviously the more sinister aspect is what we have here in front of us in terms of aspects of what they term the iron harvest. 6 French civilians on average are killed every single year as a result of coming into contact directly with the munitions. And the ongoing problem that you have now is that whilst this stuff would have been relatively safe to handle had they recovered it 100 years ago, the chemicals within the content of the actual explosive are now beginning to react, and these are making these things extremely dangerous. A lightning strike, for example, if you've got munitions just below the surface, a lightning strike is sufficient to cause these to explode. And a lot of the area where the fighting originally took place has now had to revert back to agriculture because obviously life needs to go on. This results in that out of these 6 civilians killed on average every year, the bulk of these tend to be farmers. They will plough these things up, hence the term the iron harvest, because this is most prominent during that sort of time of year, whenever the fields are being ploughed. Anybody who's familiar with the quieter, more rural roads around Belgium and northern France will, I'm sure, be familiar with the piles of rusted metal sitting by the side of the road. They will be items like these which have been ploughed from the fields and collected by, thankfully, haven't exploded, but then are left in set places for the bomb disposal teams to collect before moving them to their local depot, where they can actually sit for anything from up to sort of 5 to 10 years, such is the volume of these munitions, before being taken for central disposal.
And you were also saying as well that the chemicals, because they're breaking down, the chemicals are going into the water systems in France.
This is again another problem with obviously these things now. Iron by its very nature rusts, and 100 years underground is obviously going to help to accelerate that process. Be it high explosive or indeed gas. I mean, the gas is equally as toxic now, 100 years on, as if it was fired 100 years ago. It hasn't deteriorated in its potency. And as these things go into the ground, the casings break down, the contents will obviously leach into the soil, which in turn then gets into the groundwater. And we're now reading reports that there are birth defects happening in and around the areas where the fighting was the most intense, because obviously it's now getting into the human food chain. With a 900-tonne extraction rate per year currently ongoing, the legacy of World War I is likely to be around with us for about another 700 years.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul, for educating us on that. It's fascinating.
You're very welcome.